Hello, everybody. Welcome. It is nice to see you. Happy Thursday. Happy almost Shabbos. It is lovely to see you. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and a Daily Dose of Talmud, and you are here for a 30-minute review of what happened in Daf Yomi this week. Now, pretty securely into Tractate Sanhedrin. And as you know, we have a wonderful cast of teachers who lead this class. And this morning, we're joined by Rabbi Lexi Boatsum. So Rabbi Boatsum, I think we're pretty much all in at the door and you can get started.
Amazing. Well, a lot of fun stuff within this past week. Obviously, always a lot of fun things, but I think Sanhedrin is particularly juicy at the beginning, as you saw with the very long Mishnah to start us off. So this week we finished up the first parak, the first chapter of Sanhedrin. And so near the end of this chapter, we saw some stuff about prophesying and some interesting focuses in on the case of a minor Sanhedrin, right? The Sanhedrin of 23 that can be located in various cities. And we talked about the requirements of who can serve on these Sanhedrins, right? The sort of knowledge they need to have, both of law and also of witchcraft and also of language in order to be able to judge accurately. And what kind of cities and locales have enough people and a lot of the sort of basic city infrastructure to merit having this sort of minor Sanhedrin, right? So that's the end of our first chapter. And then we enter the main chapter of this past week, right? Which is the second parak. It starts off by talking about the Kohen Gadol and the king, right? So the high priest and the king, and it sort of juxtaposes them because despite the fact that we generally have a principle that all Jews are judged equally according to the law, the high priest and the king are exceptions to that rule. The high priest only a little bit, right? That this first Mishnah says the main thing is that the Kohen Gadol, if he is facing capital judgment, that happens in front of the full Sanhedrin of 71, right? And there are things he can't do like yibum, like levirate marriage, because he can't marry a widow. But otherwise, for the most part, the Kohen Gadol, it says, Dan v'daninoto, he can judge, we can judge him. He can perform all of these other functions. He can do chalitza, right, the releasing of levirate marriage. He can't go to the funeral of a loved one, but he can sort of, follow after the biur, kind of playing hide and seek as they go out towards the cemetery. And we talk a little bit about how we console him, right? So in some ways, as this kind of paragon of the epitome of what holiness looks like, who is something of a slightly above your average human figure for the Jewish people, there are some ways in which he's an exception. But for the most part, we actually still treat him as a person who is judged and can judge like the rest of us. But the king is the actual exception, right? The Mishnah says, we don't judge him, he can't judge us. He doesn't perform any of these functions around levirate marriage or around the chalitza, the releasing of it. He doesn't do all these things that are considered to be also beneath his dignity. You can't marry his widow unless maybe you're a king. So the king is in many ways sort of outside of the normal law system. And so the chapter kind of digs into some of these laws, right? We get some of the interesting things around the high priest and the question of how they go to an Ir Miklat, right? The city of refuge, even though the way cities of refuge are defined, when you're usually released, is when the high priest dies, right? So if you're a high priest and you go to one of those, you are unfortunately there forever. And we talk about sort of broader rules of mourning that come up based off of this Mishnah, right? The rules of mourning are kind of scattered a bit throughout tractates. And so from these mentions of how we mourn and how we console the Kohen Gadol and the king, we kind of delve a little more broadly into how this kind of process of consolation works. But then we dive really deep into the rules around the kings. We get the origin of why do we say that kings can't judge or be judged, right? That actually this only applies to the kings of Israel, right? The kings of the house of David, we say that it's not that a king is actually inherently above the law, right? The Gemara clarifies that this was not sort of the Ikar Hadin. This was not how things were originally designed to work. and that the kings of David, who are like just and fair, they can judge and we can judge them. But the kings of the house of Israel, we get this origin story with King Yanai within the sort of Hasmonean dynasty, where we see this utter failure of an attempt to judge him, right? That like his slave kills somebody, he is meant to be held accountable, and the judges are unwilling to hold him accountable, right? And so Shimon ben Shetach, one of the rabbis at the time, sort of sees this as a proof that like the system is unable to hold the king accountable, right? That they're sort of unwilling to impose that judgment upon him. And so then it becomes a rule, right? That we don't judge the kings and they can't judge, right? And moving forward, we get into all the rules around, we get a lot of stories from Malachim, which obviously is where the books of Kings are where we get the actual narratives about this, because in Chumash, in the first 5 books of Torah, we don't have any Jewish kings that exist. So we have a lot of stories about Shmuel and David and their various wives, the question of how many wives the king can have, how many horses they can have, their ability to the fact that if they go out on a optional war, right, a war that is not a milchamet mitzvah, that they are required to get the approval of the entire Sanhedrin to conscript people. So we're getting really deeply into both the restrictions on the king, right, the things he can't do too much of, and the sort of incredibly, in some ways, unfettered rights he has towards like, if there's war, he can just carve a path through people's fields, and the ability to like take people's spoil for the first time, which we'll see more in depth. And we do have a nice bit about how he needs to write a Sefer Torah for himself, actually 2 Sefer Torah for himself to carry around all the time. Because on the one hand, we're in many ways creating the status of king that has very few limitations on it. But on the other hand, there is some desire to believe that the king is sort of still bound by the same laws that we're operating by, right? So he has to carry around a little Torah at all times. So that is a sort of our overview of the content that we've looked at in the last week. And I want to, and we also in the very end talk about choosing judges for litigating monetary cases. So we shift away from the king focus. But for what we're going to look at inside, I want us to return to the king focus. And we're going to look at some sources that I think kind of tease out some of the ambiguity and the ambivalence of how people are relating to the sort of status of a Jewish king. So I'm gonna share this source sheet, but I think I'm also gonna share my screen. But if people want to open it up on their own screens, I put the link in the chat. So we're gonna start here with some Tanakh, actually. We're gonna start with this section from Shmuel Aleph, right? This is one that gets referenced in our Gemara, because this is where the people ask Shmuel for a king, right? So I'm just gonna, for the sake of time, read this in the English. So we have all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Shmuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations." Shmuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." And Shmuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Shmuel, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you, for it is not you they have rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly, and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them." So before we get into Shmuel's litany, what are people's initial reactions to the intro, right? The origins of this request of Shmuel. How does Shmuel feel about it? How does God feel about it? Right? What is the sentiment sort of we're getting in Tanakh up to this point? You can also either answer in the chat or people can raise their hands and talk. right? We have a warning against kings. So someone asked why are kings exempt from judgment? Just because we seem unable to enforce judgment. Are we expecting God to judge the king? It's a great question. I have learned the story about Yaunai that I mentioned with a teacher of mine, or Daniel Landis, and he really sees it as like a tragic story, right? Like one that I think really paints really like impacts the whole tone of how we talk about the kings moving forward, that we're not treating some of these rules as lichatchila ideal, right? As the way we would want things to be. But the not judging them is portrayed as like potentially it's not possible to have a monarchic system where you can fairly judge and be judged by the ruler of such a system. So, Stephen, you're on mute.
Keep in mind that this was written, most likely, this Parthenos was written at the time of the return or the return from Babylonian exile or afterward. By that point, there have been quite a few kings over first, of course, and David and Solomon, but then the kings of the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and quite a few of them were absolutely miserable rulers, and I think that may have been written, but with that perspective may have formed the kind of litany that was attributed to Shmuel.
Right. That I think it's a fair point that when we think from a biblical critical perspective, the what people have actually experienced at the times maybe being written can really inform how they're currently feeling about a monarchy. But I agree with the sentiment we're mostly getting in this chat is that certainly the intro to this demand on the part of the people does not suggest that Shmuel or God feel positively about it, right? That God presents it as like idolatrous, right? That they are looking for someone essentially to replace me. They want a king to rule instead of me. Leah?
Uh, it's already been mentioned, I think, because we have a hard boundary between the divine and the temporal. Any attempt to have a king might be, be pushing on that boundary more than human beings can resist. And I think the reluctance has to do with the fact that we're all just human, and the temptation to put a monarch above everything else and almost deify that person is horrendously great. And also that we see in the time of the Hasmonea that all of a sudden the priests, the Hasmonea were priests, and then they took the kingship upon themselves and did dastardly things in this 100 and some odd years, I think 130 years that they were in power. I think here it is simply recognizing that we are humans, we are fallible, and if we don't keep a hard boundary between Hashem, between the world of the divine and our world of creation, of having been created, but a boundary between the creator and the created, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think that, again, we have this sort of distinction between prophets and their role of authority, which is like sometimes involves a political component, but the whole thing that vests them with authority is them sharing the word of God, right? It is essentially them as intermediary of God's rule, whereas the king is portrayed as like not necessarily serving that function. Like they are a political ruler and not purely by virtue of them sharing and acting on God's word. So we see this sort of background reluctance, and now Shmuel is bringing back this information to the people, right? So Shmuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king, in case you'd forgotten. He said, "This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as chiefs of thousands and fifties, for they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers. He will take a tenth part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men and your asses, and put them to work for him. He will take a tenth part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day. But the people would not listen to Shmuel's warning. No, they said, we must have a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations. Let our king rule over us and go at our head and fight our battles. When Shmuel heard all the people said, he reported it to the Lord. And the Lord said to Shmuel, heed their demands and appoint a king for them. And Shmuel said to the men of Israel, all of you go home. Okay, so we get this long sort of litany from Shmuel about all of the things, the sort of relatively unchecked power of a king to just like take advantage of all of these people's resources. And then the way that gets translated into halacha is a fascinating thing that we're going to zoom in on, right? So we're going to look at the Mishnah and some of the Gemara from Sanhedrin 20b, right? So the Mishnah here is getting into some of the limitations and powers of the king. It says, "Motzi lemilchemet hareshut al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad," right? That the king can only bring out and conscript people into a optional war by virtue of approval from the Great Sanhedrin. Uparetz lasot l'derech ve'ein memacha biyado, and can like break, like break people's fences and basically create a path for himself through people's property, and they can't protest. Derech hamelech ein lo shiur, and also there's no minimum size that these roads he's making through people's property can be. And everyone who like takes spoils, they like give it to him first and he can take his portion, right? Now, there are some commentators who debate whether this whole bit about taking over people's property and creating roads, whether that's a right that he has at all times or only during times of war, but minimally when they are fighting, these are powers that we say the king has. So now we're going to look at the Gemara, where we focus on this Shmuel section that we read above and see some sort of different Amoraic opinions about what the sort of authoritative nature or even like positive or negative valences of that sort of section from Tanakh happen to be, right? So Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, concerning all the actions that are stated in the biblical passage about the king, right, this one in Shmuel, it is permitted for a king to perform them. Rav says, this biblical passage was stated only in order to threaten the Jewish people so they would accept the king's sovereignty with reverence. As it is stated, you shall set a king over you, meaning it is necessary that his fear should be upon you. Right? So we see this Amoraic dispute about the sort of legal force of Shmuel's listing of all the things a king can do. Right? Shmuel and Rav, who are classic bar pluktas, classic disputers, Shmuel thinks that, yeah, he funnily enough, Shmuel talking about Shmuel the prophet, thinks that Shmuel the prophet is in fact outlining all the things a king will be able to do. He says, you want a king, just so you know, here are all the things he's permitted to do and all of the massive powers he has over you and your resources. And so we should look to that list and it should be like a checklist, right? Like the king can do all of those things. He can take your children, he can conscript people, he can take your slaves, he can take this amount of your produce, etc. Whereas Rav is like, no, this passage is rhetorical, right? It was meant to scare people. Shmuel was not actually saying that a king has the right to do all of those things. He was saying all of these things so that people would sort of be afraid of a king's power. Now, something I want to point out that I think is fascinating and arguably not the pshat most intuitive read of the passage is that Rav isn't saying that Shmuel was stating this in order to discourage people from having a king. He's saying that this was like threatening people so that they should have sufficient awe and fear of a king who is placed over them, right? Where like personally, my own take is that I think the pshat of the Shmuel passage is that he's in fact trying to scare them out of having a king, right? He is trying to list all of these powers so that they don't want a king. Whereas by the time we get to the Amoraim, even the passage that says the king doesn't have all these abilities, even that opinion says, oh, he doesn't have those abilities, but it was being stated so that you should have sufficient fear of a king and their power, right? And we see this dates back a little bit earlier than the Amoraim, right? The Gemara says this dispute is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim. As it is taught in a Baraita, Rabbi Yossi says, concerning all the actions stated in this biblical passage about the king, it is permitted for a king to perform them. Rabbi Yehuda says this biblical passage was stated only in order to threaten the Jewish people. As it is stated, you shall set a king over you, meaning it is necessary his fear should be upon you, right? So that's basically the exact parallel of what we saw between Rav and Shmuel. But the Baraita, right, the Tannaitic material continues. So would Rabbi Yehuda say, 3 mitzvot were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into Eretz Yisrael. They were commanded to establish a king for themselves and to cut off the seed of Amalek and to build the chosen house. So Rabbi Yehuda thinks that all of these things, destroying Amalek, building the temple, and establishing a king, are commandments, right? The Jewish people, it was an obligation for them to establish a king upon entering Eretz Yisrael, right? As is mentioned in Devarim and Deuteronomy. But Rabbi Nahorai says this biblical passage about appointing a king was stated only in response to the Jewish people's complaint. As it is stated, when you come unto the land the Lord gives you, and possess it, and dwell therein, and shall say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. So Rabbi Nahorai, at this point, they're analyzing the passage in Deuteronomy, right, where God also mentions a king. Rabbi Yehuda sees that as a commandment. He says, yeah, you are obligated to create a king. Rabbi Nahorai says, no, it's God predicting what the Jewish people will do. Throughout Dvarim, right, God constantly predicts via Moshe all the ways that the people are going to turn away from God, right, and turn away from religion and all of the bad things they're going to do. And so Rabbi Nahorai says this is God predicting what's going to happen and what the response will be, right? Saying that, yes, I know you guys are going to demand a king. And so this is what will happen. If you do that, this is how you should respond. But if they happen to never demand a king, you certainly aren't obligated to appoint one, right? So these are very different ways of relating to, is it considered obligatory and therefore seemingly a positive or a necessity to have a king? Or is it actually just a reflection of sort of the Jewish people's lack of emunah, lack of faith, that God knows this is going to happen and so creates kind of a fail-safe mechanism, but doesn't see this as something that they should or must do, right? And then a separate Baraita, I think, also reflects an interesting kind of tension within the Shmuel section we read, right? It is taught, Rabbi Eliezer says, the elders of Shmuel's generation asked appropriately, as it is stated, give us a king to judge us. But the ignoramuses among them ruined it, as it is stated, people refused to heed the voice of Shmuel. They said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and emerge before us and fight our battles, right? So Rabbi Eliezer, I would say, kind of has a position that feels somewhere between the like Rabbi Yehuda stance and Rabbi Nahorai, right? Rabbi Eliezer seems to think there is a model of a king that actually would be good, right? That like the way the elders initially asked of give us a king to judge us, that yeah, they were asking for a leader who could kind of replace Shmuel, who could like judge them justly. They were looking for someone who could produce like structure and stability and sort of actually help rein in some of the chaos that was going on throughout the period of the judges of the Shoftim. And so yeah, they wanted someone to be a just like ruler who could adjudicate their cases. But the Amei Haaretz, the ignoramuses, they wanted a warlord, right? The thing they ask is, we want a king just so that we can be like all the other people. We want to be identical to all the other peoples who have their monarchs, and we want him to like fight our battles for us, right? And so Rabbi Eliezer is like the model that actually ends up being assumed, right? The demand that is ultimately made is not a good one, right? That like certainly the model of king that the Amei Haaretz are asking for, he does not think is a positive. So I'll pause here and read some of the comments in the chat. I think I'm interested to hear what people are sitting with after this passage, because I find it given that this whole chapter really delves into the role and the power of the king. I think it reflects, again, like a really fascinating ambivalence on the part of the rabbis, that on the one hand, you see some rabbis who really sort of want to defend or bolster the position. I think in part because provided it ends up existing, some of the rabbis don't want to relate to it as b'diavad, as like an after the fact thing. They don't want to relate to this like powerful position that existed as having been fundamentally unideal for centuries. That's actually not the way you were supposed to function. And certainly Tanakh itself sort of shifts a bit in its relationship to monarchy vis-a-vis all the promises made to the house of David, which I think someone made in the chat. So some of them are like, no, we're gonna like kind of justify the king a bit more. We're gonna say that like there are some positives to this. If we already have this position, maybe we'll find a way to kind of redeem it. And there are others who seem to be still deeply uncomfortable with the king and his power, who say this was actually never an ideal, and we're willing to acknowledge that it exists now, but we don't actually think this is what we were supposed to do. So yeah, I'm gonna look through the chat, but does anyone have any, if you want to raise your hand and have any comments or things that are really sticking out to you, would love to hear. Yeah, so we see more people also mentioning that how these texts are informed by people's past experience of kings, which as if, you know, to the extent that Malachim is an accurate relation of some of that was a very mixed bag, depending on both which kingdom you were in and which kings you were dealing with. What was Shmuel's title or position? Shmuel was a prophet, but also generally functioned as like a political leader as well. We see, yes, the philosopher king. Seems like a dumb idea. It's like saying the way to solve a problem is not to have it. I think that's somewhat accurate. It's a bit of an ideal that I would say most philosophers acknowledge never existed. That saying, oh, theoretically, if you could have someone who fulfilled this exact role and combined all of these ideal traits, then it could be great. Essentially acknowledging, but you're never going to, right? That's not actually how they're going to function. And so, okay, someone's asking about the Babylonian kings. Well, the Babylonian kings are not kings of the Israelites, right? That here we're talking about Jewish kings. We're talking about kings of, or maybe Jewish is actually a bit of an anachronism. We're talking about Israelite and Judean kings. So the Babylonian kings are non-Jewish kings who rule over the Israelites in exile at various points. But these rules are all about the powers and potential obligatory nature of the kings of the Israelites and what they can and should do.
Maybe Rabbi Bosim, it would be helpful to do like a really brief summary of the Jewish/Israelite monarchies.
Right. So we have these again, and
And there was when was there a Jewish king and when wasn't there?
yes. So upon initially entering the land, we have a period of several centuries where there are no kings. There are just these like shoftim, these judges who are sort of like political leaders slash in some cases more of warlords. But it's not a very centralized government or authority. And then after Shmuel, right, we see here when the people demand a king, that is when Shaul, King Saul, is chosen as like the first king of Israel, right? And so we have Shaul, who is sort of followed slash usurped by David, who's followed by his son Shlomo, Solomon. And we see these are all happening like we see eventually a fracture after these handful of united kingdoms into the Judean and the Israelite kingdoms, right? And so this is what I mentioned earlier, where the Mishnah says, or the Gemara says that the kings of Judea, the kings who were descending from the house of David, the Mishnah or the Gemara has a more positive opinion of them and says those kings were very just, right? And they could judge us, we could judge them. We trust them to be like not totally above the law. But the Israelite kings, granted, kings in both of those kingdoms had really mixed records over the centuries, according to Malachim. But they at least have sort of more faith in the kings of Judea to sort of ultimately portray some kind of positive character. Whereas the Israelite kings were, for the most part, largely portrayed as like disobeying Hashem, often going into idolatry, killing people. There are some that are worse than others, but the record is not great. And obviously there's the exile, there's like return from the exile and sort of not able to reestablish the same form of monarchy. We have the Hasmoneans, who we just celebrated a holiday related to them very recently, who Leah mentioned. They are the sort of monarchs who really have very incomplete power. They're essentially client state in the last like century BCE and leading into the beginning of the CEs until Rome fully conquers the land and expels, destroys the temple, destroys the monarchy, etc. There's also queens. Yeah, we also see Queen Shlomtzion, who is related to Yanai, the one who, according to the Gemara, kicked off the whole inability to judge. Shlomtzion, who is related to him, is considered to be well, less bad than Yanai, but the bar is pretty low. So yes, but for the most part, kings, we don't have many instances of queens who had like independent power, but we have many queens who have varying levels of authority over the people.
Okay, we are about at time. So I wanted to say thank you for this lesson, Rabbi Botzum, and thank you to all of you for the good comments and questions and participation. And we will wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who are in the LA area and are in Southern California and are affected by the wildfires, we are thinking about you especially. I know there's at least one person on this call for whom that is true. So wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll be in your inbox tomorrow and in this space in exactly a week. Okay, bye everyone.